In recent years, I've become increasingly obsessed with a genre of music called progressive soul. Spinning out of the psychedelic scenes of the late 60s, progressive soul was created by a cohort of visionary geniuses who sought to elevate popular music to new heights. Artists like Curtis Mayfield, Isaac Hayes, Stevie Wonder, and Marvin Gaye defied labels and pushed boundaries to create some of the greatest albums of all time. They made music that was innovative and expansive, built around extended grooves and lush orchestral arrangements. There's just so much to love about this genre, and really my original plan with this video was just kind of to wax poetic about it for a while. But then I started to dig a little deeper into the genre, and I tried to look into the literature, and I found something strange. There's kind of not really much literature to look into. There's plenty of writing on all of the artists who made progressive soul, but there's a shockingly small body of work actually discussing the genre itself. Most of the writing on progressive soul is one-off sentences in album or concert reviews. There's some music reference books and encyclopedias that name drop the genre, but on the whole, progressive soul has gone a long time with shockingly little written about it. This is especially evident when you compare it to its cousin, progressive rock, which has been the subject of extensive discussion from music press, fans, and academia alike for, well, almost as long as the genre's been around. It's really only in the last decade or so that the music world has really started to engage with progressive soul as its own canon. Hell, the genre only got a Wikipedia page in 2021, and it was only made an official genre on Rate Your Music in 2024. While these sorts of crowdsourced sites obviously aren't the sole authority on music, they're good bellwethers for understanding how audiences engage with the musical world. And what they're telling us is that a 50-year-old genre is really starting to come together in the public imagination, shifting from a loose collection of ideas into a codified movement. That's really exciting to me because it means that all of us get to be an active part of a conversation that's redefining how we understand music history. So I guess this video is kind of going to be my contribution to that conversation. Let's do that whole let's take a closer look business. I don't think it's necessary to frame progressive soul within the context of progressive rock, but I do think it's useful, especially given my background and probably a lot of my audience's background, so that's what we're gonna do here. The genres are two distinct movements with very little actual crossover, but they share a sort of cultural lineage and a similar vision of what popular music could be. Both movements pull influence from a broad array of sources, but their origins can both be found in the psychedelic revolution of the 1960s. Before the 1960s, there was kind of this divide in the music world between what was seen as classical music and pop music. Pop music basically meant anything radio-friendly, anything for commercial consumption, so that meant a lot of rock and roll and a lot of soul music, especially in the 60s. But as the baby boomer generation came of age and the psychedelic movement happened and there was just all of this kind of like cultural upheaval happening in the 60s, musicians began to take a new look at pop music. These artists believed that popular music didn't just need to be something consumerist, it could be elevated into an intellectual pursuit. Bands like the Beatles and the Beach Boys were at the forefront of this, experimenting with new song structures and creating little pocket symphonies. Meanwhile, acts like Jimi Hendrix were pushing instrumental virtuosity and technical experimentation. The progressive movements were born out of all of these ideas, but they would push things one step further. They look to the extended song structures of classical music and the innovations of jazz. One album that proved particularly influential on both prog rock and prog soul was John Coltrane's 1965 masterpiece, A Love Supreme. That entire album is a sophisticated avant-garde jazz suite tied together by a thematic spiritualism. It pushed jazz into new territories, and it was a brilliant example of using the album as a medium to connect songs into part of a greater work. That kind of album-spanning vision would become an essential part of progressive music. When these new genres came about, it was the pinnacle of the vinyl era, and people were just starting to truly understand how packaging and sequencing an album could reshape the listening experience. But for all the similarities between progressive rock and progressive soul, there were plenty of differences as well. The technicality in progressive rock focused on strange key changes, odd time signatures, and complex harmonic interactions. Meanwhile, the technical edge of progressive soul was more focused on rhythm and groove. Where a prog rock masterpiece would cartwheel through a dozen key changes and time signatures, some of the greatest progressive soul pieces innovate by sitting perfectly in the pocket, stretching out complex, syncopated grooves for extended periods while instrumentalists trade bars on top. This sort of structure is heavily influenced by James Brown, the godfather of soul and a predecessor who looms large over the progressive soul movement. The band setup of progressive soul is quite different from prog rock as well. Prog rock is a tradition of relatively small bands, with outfits of around 4 to 5 members who tended to write within vaguely democratic parameters. These bands generally consisted of 1 to 2 guitars, a bass, 1 drummer, and a keyboardist. To get the larger, more orchestral sound, prog rock bands would often turn to synthesizers. Progressive soul, on the other hand, was born from a tradition of larger orchestras playing music created and curated by a band leader. A lot of the finest recordings of progressive soul were done by in-house studio bands made up of session musicians. Often, these session musicians were even augmented by things like string orchestras. This bigger scale was possible in the early days of progressive soul because many of those innovating the genre were already established artists with the backing of successful pop studios. Even when progressive soul acts were closer to a rock band setup, they tended to be larger, including horn sections and often multiple percussionists. There were some lyrical commonalities between prog rock and prog soul. Both were drawn to the fantastical future, incorporating otherworldly sci-fi imagery into their songs, but they used this imagery in different ways. For prog rock, it was often escapism, if not pure fantasy, providing lush visual imagery to guide and augment the instrumental virtuosity. Prog soul, on the other hand, incorporated these sci-fi influences into a very real and immediate fight for racial justice. And just as often as it was wild and imaginative, progressive soul was taking a grounded look at the bleak life in America's collapsing inner cities. Prog soul artists would sing about drugs and prostitution, crime, and systemic injustice. And that brings us to the clearest and most important divide between the two genres: race. Though black American musicians had invented rock and roll, it had become mostly white by the end of the 60s, and progressive rock was innovated by white British bands. Meanwhile, soul as a genre had stayed very black since its inception in the late 50s. Soul was rooted in a lot of the same influences as rock, drawing on jazz and rhythm and blues, but it combined these with the rich gospel traditions of the black church. This tie to the black church tradition also tied soul music to the civil rights movement, and it became the soundtrack to a decade of political action. Because of these ties to the civil rights movement and the outspoken black pride of many of its leaders, soul remained a predominantly black space through the 60s. That racial divide is probably the single biggest reason why progressive soul hasn't gotten the attention it should until recent years. Dating back to the earliest days of jazz, there's been a pervasive racist notion in the music industry that black music is more spontaneous and primitive than a supposedly intellectual white music. In 2019, music scholar Jay Keister argued that this is the main reason why black musicians have been left out of discussions on progressive music for so long, despite having music that so clearly fits the prog mold. That paper is called Black Prog: Soul, Funk, Intellect, and the Progressive Side of Black Music. It seems to me that this essay is actually one of the key pieces responsible for our modern reevaluation of progressive soul, so we're going to be referring back to it a few times throughout this video, and I'll drop a link to it in the description. While this racial bias might be the main reason progressive soul hasn't gotten as much attention, it's not the only one. Early on in the progressive rock movement, its pioneers chose to self-identify with the label of progressive rock. The liner notes of Caravan's 1969 self-titled debut stand as a sort of manifesto for progressive rock. They read, "Caravan belonged to a new breed of progressive rock groups, freeing themselves from the restricting conventions of pop music by using unusual time signatures and sophisticated harmonies. Their arrangements involve variations of tempo and dynamics of almost symphonic complexity." Progressive soul had no such declaration of label, and I think that's because a lot of them didn't really need it. Most of the biggest progressive soul artists were already established names before they pivoted to this new movement. An upstart band of daring experimentalists might latch on to an exciting new term for publicity, but Marvin Gaye didn't need any publicity. He just needed to release an album with the words Marvin Gaye on the cover. Because there was no need for these artists to label themselves, and because so much of the categorization of emergent genres at the time was done by a white industry unwilling to see these black artists under the prog umbrella, black prog was sort of set adrift for a long time. Which brings us to now, where we're going to take a look at this canon and understand how it's been defined in the past and how we're redefining it now. I think it's important to note that the bounds of any genre are fluid and up for debate, and I'm far from a final authority on these sorts of things. If you disagree with my assessment of this canon, I'd love to hear your vision of it in the comments, because these sorts of things are defined through conversation and general consensus. So with that being said, let's take a dive into this canon. Now this is the part where I get to wax poetic. To build out our progressive soul canon, we're going to start with two musical giants, each of whom innovated a different aspect of the movement: Sly Stone and Isaac Hayes. While there were other early influences, and we'll talk about that a bit later, Stone and Hayes were responsible for the first two classic albums of the genre: Stand, released in May 1969, and Hot Buttered Soul, released just a month later. These two albums together represent what I see as two aesthetically separate but philosophically connected sides of the same music. Sly and the Family Stone are representative of the rock and psychedelic influence on soul. They grew out of a San Francisco music scene that was the epicenter of America's psychedelic movement. Their sound was a reflection of Sly Stone's history as a radio DJ, where he would put together eclectic playlists mixing white British rock musicians with black American R&B. Over the course of the late 60s, Sly and the Family Stone released several albums of psychedelic funk and soul. Each of these featured intense innovation and groove, but it was Stand that truly pushed things into progressive territory. That entire album is a radical ode to political action and racial progress. The title track is a clear call to make your voice heard, while Everyday People preaches a utopian vision of racial equality. We got to live together.
I am no better, and neither are you. We are the same, whatever we do.
And Sly Stone practiced what he preached. His band was made up of different genders and different racial identities. The Family Stone stand as a paragon of the 60s dream of a racially integrated utopia. But not all of Stand is steeped in that optimism. There's a distinct paranoia in Somebody's Watching You, and a tense darkness in, well, I'm not gonna say the name of that one out loud.
Don't call me nigga. Don't call me water. Nigga.
The radical lyrics of Stand are paired with music that is just as radical and progressive. Songs throughout the album break from conventional pop structure, veering into strange and unexpected places, like the surprise gospel-tinged freak-out jam at the end of the title track. Sing a Simple Song ironically pairs a simple message and lyrics with a complex and experimental groove that's filled to the brim with instrumental and vocal punctuations. That whole song, and really the whole album, is built from the rhythm section out, with a groove locked down by Larry Graham, a legendary innovator on the bass. As Sly and the Family Stone were riding high on the last surge of the 60s dream, Isaac Hayes was creating a blueprint for a sound that would define the 70s. Hayes was a product of the soul industry, getting his start as a session musician and writer for Memphis's Stax Records. There, he was part of a tradition of creating tight, commercial 3-minute pop songs, writing songs like Sam and Dave's Soul Man and Hold On, I'm Coming. But in 1969, Stax Records found themselves in dire straits after losing their entire back catalog due to a split with Atlantic Records. Al Bell responded with a strategy called the Soul Explosion, where he gave pretty much the entire roster of musicians free rein to create their own albums. Hayes took this mandate and ran with it, making an album that had no designs on commerciality whatsoever. But that didn't mean abandoning the sort of pop songs he'd made a career on. Instead, it meant expanding them. Hot Buttered Soul opens on a radical interpretation of Walk On By, a classic pop song written by Bacharach and David that was released by Dionne Warwick in 1965. Hayes takes the original 3-minute pop song and blows it up, stretching it into a greasy, gut-wrenching 12-minute epic. Hayes creates an arrangement for the song that just absolutely soars, with gentle orchestration, carefully placed flutes, and immaculate vocal arrangements. It milks the song for every drop of emotion and turns it into a raw and dramatic piece. By the end of the song, Walk On By has swelled to a giant climax, clashing the gentle orchestral arrangement with roaring psychedelic music. And the rest of Hot Buttered Soul follows in this mold, with the entire album featuring only 4 tracks. The longest of these is a reinterpretation of the country song By the Time I Get to Phoenix, which runs almost 19 minutes. By the Time I Get to Phoenix is a display of an experimental vocal style that Hayes dubbed rapping, where he would improvise elaborate narratives on top of long, drawn-out musical pieces.
But she said, oh, go on, fool, you doing it. But the man wasn't doing it, but that's the only excuse she could give him. He said, Mama, I can't take it, I got to leave you. I'm gonna leave you.
Hot Buttered Soul was a surprise hit, proving the market for extended, album-length works by black soul artists. Hayes would take this idea and run with it, becoming a key figure in the progressive soul movement as he continued to experiment with stretched-out pop songs. In 1971, he'd write the score for Shaft, bringing soul music closer to the classical tradition that underpinned a lot of movie scores. Hayes' music has been labeled cinematic soul in the past, a label we might understand as a subgenre or a musical trend within progressive soul. And Shaft isn't the only cinematic soul piece key to our progressive soul canon. Curtis Mayfield's 1972 soundtrack to Superfly exemplifies so many of the key tenets of progressive soul, using long drawn-out grooves and intricate orchestral arrangements. Superfly was the third album of Mayfield's progressive era, following up 1971's Roots and 1970's Curtis. Before he went prog, Mayfield was already a leader of the 60s soul movement as the primary songwriter and frontman for the Impressions. Their 1965 song, People Get Ready, was a civil rights anthem that made Mayfield a key figure in the Black Pride movement. And when he struck out solo in 1970, he doubled down on this political edge. Curtis is a deeply political album, defined by a pair of extended progressive pieces that open each side of the record. First, there's the bleak and atmospheric Don't Worry, If There's Hell Below, We're All Gonna Go. That song is a tormented shout into the void, laid over some of the slickest grooves you'll ever hear.
Lord, what we're gonna do?
It's thrown into sharp contrast when you flip the record and encounter the relentless optimism of Move On Up. For me, Move On Up might be the prototypical progressive soul piece. It's rooted in soul's gospel origins, with a callback to Mahalia Jackson, but then Mayfield flavors it with an open psychedelic optimism and ties it together with a distinctly 70s sound palette, riding on the back of immaculate horn arrangements and some of the best percussion you will ever hear in your life. The entirety of the song's near 9-minute length is propelled by Henry Gibson's relentless conga rhythms, which perfectly embody the instrumental ambition of the progressive soul movement. I think Curtis Mayfield might have one of the deepest catalogs of prog soul, with at least a dozen stone-cold classics of the genre to his name. One of his more overlooked songs from this era is Right On for the Darkness, from 1973's Back to the World. Personally, I think this is a perfect prog soul song.
You know you must regain all your
most commercially successful acts out of progressive soul both came from Motown's hit factory in the 60s, though both of them had to fight Motown's Berry Gordy for permission to even make progressive soul in the first place. In 1971, Marvin Gaye demanded complete creative control and used that to create What's Going On, a conceptual piece about the strange state of America that's now celebrated as one of the greatest albums ever made. The standout track might be Inner City Blues Make Me Wanna Holler, which criticizes the systemic racism within the American government while painting a bleak picture of urban life.
Money, we make it. For we see it, you take it. Oh, make me wanna holler the way they do my life.
Marvin Gaye inspired his Motown labelmate Stevie Wonder to jump into the movement in 1972. Just 22 years old at the time, Stevie Wonder had already made a career for himself as a child prodigy in Motown. His jump to prog soul marked the beginning of one of the greatest runs in recording history. Wonder's so-called classic period saw him record 5 albums in 5 years. He completely took over the pop world and showed the brilliance of progressive soul to a wide mainstream audience. He would explore the conceptual, political side of the movement on songs like Living for the City.
He's almost dead from breathing in air pollution. He tried to thought, but to him that's no solution. Living just enough for the shit.
The culmination of Wonder's classic period was 1976's Songs in the Key of Life, a sprawling double album that manages to delve into the entirety of the human condition. That album mixes influences from jazz and Latin music and experiments with a cutting-edge synthesizer technology. There's so many songs we could talk about from across Wonder's classic period, going from pieces that are a little more pop-tinged to full-on experimental progressive soul. My personal favorite of these is the sprawling, cosmic love song As, which is definitely further on the progressive side of Wonder's works. For all the success and triumph of prog soul, it wasn't a genre without its tragedies. After reaching his pinnacle at the end of the 60s, Sly Stone spiraled into a cycle of addiction and depression as the decade turned, alienating most of his band in the process. Still, in 1971, Sly Stone was able to release There's a Riot Going On, an album whose title was a direct response to Marvin Gaye. There's a Riot Going On is one of the heaviest and darkest works of the prog soul movement. It featured innovative use of the drum machine and a strange, muddy sound palette that echoed the darkness looming over so much of America in the early 70s.
Just like a baby.
That same darkness looms over War's 1972 album, The World is a Ghetto, another essential addition to our progressive soul canon. The title track of that album is a 10-minute study in rhythmic atmosphere, sitting in a bleak, jazz-tinged melancholy.
Don't you know that it's true that for me and for you the world is a ghetto.
Okay, so with everyone we've named here, we're starting to see a pretty clear canon develop, and this video is already running very long, and it's going to run a lot longer, so I'm going to rapid fire through a few other key artists that I consider to be part of the canon. The Temptations joined their Motown label mates in the progressive soul revolution with a number of long, psychedelic-tinged tracks. Earth, Wind & Fire mixed a bunch of eclectic influences with cosmic, psychedelic imagery throughout the 70s. Baby Huey's posthumous solo album, produced by Curtis Mayfield, is a great example of the genre, featuring an expansive prog soul take on Sam Cooke's A Change Is Gonna Come. The Isley Brothers threw their hat into the prog soul ring in 1973 with 3+3. The poet Gil Scott-Heron released a number of prog albums in the early 70s, combining spoken word poetry with soul instrumentals and laying the groundwork for hip-hop in the process. A sometimes overlooked artist in the progressive soul movement is Terry Callier, who got a start doing folk music before creating a pair of multifaceted albums mixing soul, funk, and jazz with his folk sound to great effect. If you've gotten this far, you'll no doubt notice there's one key act, or, well, kind of two key acts that I haven't touched on yet. Parliament Funkadelic. P-Funk carried the psych rock and funk legacy of Sly Stone well into the 70s, building on it with their own unique Afrofuturist flair. In the limited discussions of progressive soul, they're one of the most frequently named artists, and it's easy to understand why. Jay Keister discusses them at length in his essay, noting the unique way they combine the intellectualism of the Black Prog movement with a distinct lowbrow humor and satirical edge. In Keister's essay, he cites George Clinton's memoir, where Clinton explicitly states his prog rock aspirations on Free Your Mind and Your Ass Will Follow. I tried to match the power of the band, that mix of hard rock and prog rock, of deep soul and classical composition, with appropriate lyrics, and to write something with deep meaning that gestured towards something larger and more literary. Really, of all the progressive soul acts, I think P-Funk sits closest to prog rock, owing in large part to the explicit influence that the Beatles had on Clinton. In fact, I've often said that Funkadelic would be considered part of the typical classic rock canon if it weren't for the inherent racial biases of the American music industry. And while Funkadelic played up rock influences, Parliament were more rooted in the soul tradition, as you can see on Mothership Connection. That album is as good an example of progressive soul as anything we've mentioned so far. It's a vivid conceptual piece, with the band imagining themselves as an intergalactic radio station, beaming a broadcast down from the stars and saving the world with funk. And it's loaded wall to wall with some of the most dense, danceable grooves you'll ever hear.
We gonna turn you off this mother out. Get off the ball. We gonna turn this mother out. You gotta have the fun.
Parliament's keyboardist, Bernie Worrell, is a particularly important figure in prog. He experimented a ton with synthesizers, combined classical influences into his playing, and would later go on to record with acts like Talking Heads. Funkadelic's 1975 song Atmosphere is a Worrell showpiece, and listening to it, you can really hear how close this is to a lot of prog rock, which had similar keyboard showpieces for people like Rick Wakeman. With that, I think we've covered a lot of the core canon of progressive soul, at least as it existed in its first wave. These works do encompass a wide range of sound, but taken as a whole, a clear ethos emerges, one built on elevating music through groove. Many of these works also share a distinct visual aesthetic, another key aspect of defining genre. But we're not done here yet, because like any genre, progressive soul also has a lot of edge cases where it's kind of up for debate whether they count in the canon. So now let's explore those a little. Alongside Sly Stone and Isaac Hayes, the late 60s saw a number of acts steeped in psychedelia that were approaching progressive soul but might not fit within a stricter definition of the genre. One edge case that I'm kind of interested in is Jimi Hendrix. I've seen Electric Ladyland called progressive soul, but personally, I still read it a lot more as a rock album. It has a lot of the expanded vision that both of these genres share, but it's more rooted in guitar work than it is in the rhythm section. But maybe if Hendrix didn't die tragically in 1970, he could have been a bridge between these two worlds. Another border case is The Fifth Dimension, a psychedelic pop and soul group that had a number of hits throughout the late 60s and early 70s. For me, The Fifth Dimension tends to lean more psychedelic soul, but really there's a lot of crossover between these two genres. But their one song that feels progressive to me is their biggest hit, a medley of Aquarius and Let the Sun Shine In from the musical Hair. That song uses a rich bed of orchestration, and its medley nature has an inherently progressive structure. The coda feels particularly progressive to me, with dense rhythmic groove and punchy horn arrangements that seem to predict Curtis Mayfield and Stevie Wonder's 70s works. Another psychedelic soul group who was breathing a lot of the same air as Fifth Dimension was Rotary Connection. Their earlier work laid the groundwork for progressive soul's eclecticism by combining psychedelic rock and soul with influences from across the music world. My personal favorite example of this is their cover of the Rolling Stones' Ruby Tuesday, which reimagines the song as a strange clash between psychedelic pop and medieval choral music. While I don't think this falls under the umbrella of progressive soul, it's a clear predecessor. But by the early 70s, Rotary Connection had started to embrace progressive soul, as evidenced by the marvelous track I Am the Black Gold of the Sun, another showpiece for Henry Gibson's congas. Rotary Connection's lead singer was Minnie Riperton, who would spin off into her own successful solo career. Rate Your Music counts Riperton's solo debut, Come to My Garden, as one of its highest rated progressive soul albums. Personally, while I think Riperton is a severely underrated artist, I'm not sure I would wrap her up into progressive soul. I think she kind of has her own thing going on with her blend of R&B and psychedelic folk music. But again, I'm not the authority on these things. These things are decided collectively, and there's plenty of genres with wide and diverse ranges. Another album that sits on the fringes for me is Aretha Franklin's Young, Gifted, and Black. That 1972 album sees the Queen of Soul adopting a lot of the sound palettes of progressive soul and taking a clear political stance with the title track. But most of its arrangements fall into more standard song forms, so I'm not sure about calling it progressive. On the flip side of things, there's a case to be made that Miles Davis's controversial 1972 fusion album, On the Corner, could be counted as some of the most out there progressive soul ever made. Jay Keister devotes a section of his essay to that album, calling it unmistakably black and a fusion of high and low musical ideals. And it was definitely influenced by progressive soul. Miles Davis was a huge fan of Sly and the Family Stone and frequently attended their concerts while working on the album. Another artist who I wouldn't call progressive soul, but I think is key to its development, is Nina Simone. Nina Simone was a student of classical music, in particular Bach, and she combined this with traditional spiritual songs to create what she called black classical music. While Simone's black classical is missing some of the psychedelic influence that defines progressive soul, I think she's important to talk about when we talk about the genre, especially because of her vision of elevating music to higher standards. And I mean, if you want to talk about something that is doing daring experimental stuff with rhythm and long-form song, look no further than Sinner Man. As we explore the fringes of progressive soul, there's one question that I think bears discussion. Does progressive soul need to be made by black artists? Nearly everyone we've talked about here is black, and the genre is so clearly tied to the black intellectual and political movements of the 70s, so that kind of tends to suggest a yes. But at the same time, the genre's forefather Sly Stone was at the head of an integrated band and actually rejected black nationalism. Sly Stone's music was part of envisioning a truly integrated world. And as progressive soul found its footing in the 70s, there were some white acts that saw its value and started to pull its influence into their sound. Acts like the Doobie Brothers and David Bowie. In fact, both the Doobies and Bowie are name-dropped with a little bit of shade by Parliament in P-Funk Wants to Get Funked Up.
You know, I was down south and I heard some funk with some main ingredients like Doobie Brothers, Blue Magic, David Bowie. It was cool. But can you imagine Doobie in your funk? Ho! W-E-F-U-N-K.
And that brings us to maybe my most controversial take in this whole video. I think David Bowie's Plastic Soul era could be counted in the progressive soul canon. It could be that I'm way off here and I'm trying to place a white artist within a space that is definitively black and should remain black. But Bowie was not just any run-of-the-mill blue-eyed soul singer. Young Americans and Station to Station are deliberate interpretations of the soul music happening around Bowie at the time. They very consciously stripped the vibrant heart from the genre and presented it as a hollow facsimile, an empty commercial shell. In doing so, Bowie is making a clear comment on the way that the music industry co-opts black art, a statement that aligns with the political goals of progressive soul. In a 1976 Playboy interview, Bowie described Young Americans as the squashed remains of ethnic music as it survives in the age of Muzak, written and sung by a white limey. For me, Station to Station kind of stands as a great what if. What if progressive soul had been identified by more artists and wrapped up into the dialogue of prog rock? What if the racial barriers in the music industry hadn't held back the kind of cross-cultural dialogue that Stevie Wonder and Sly Stone advocated so hard for? Maybe then this great black genre might have got more attention, and maybe it wouldn't have petered out like it did at the end of the 70s. So if this movement was so vibrant and lively through the 1970s, what happened to it? Well, for one, disco happened. The golden age of prog soul in the early to mid 70s bled seamlessly into the disco explosion of the mid to late 70s. Progressive soul was a clear influence on disco, and as the new genre took over, many of the greatest minds in the movement tried their hand at it. By the end of the decade, Curtis Mayfield, Parliament Funkadelic, and Earth, Wind & Fire were all fully embracing disco. This shift was coupled with a drastic technological change. So much of progressive soul was designed for hi-fi analog stereo systems. Honestly, it's one of my favorite things about this genre. There might be nothing out there that sounds as good on vinyl as progressive soul. But as the 80s rolled round, digital technology started to reshape the music world. Progressive soul artists experimented in these new sound palettes, and the first wave of the genre disappeared for good. Of course, the influences carried on throughout the 80s and onwards. You obviously don't get Prince without the innovation of the prog soul greats. And samples taken from the golden age of progressive soul created the foundation for several different hip-hop movements. Then there's the neo-soul revival of the late 90s that saw the Soulquarians reviving the ethos of progressive soul. D'Angelo explicitly pulled from this tradition on 2004's Voodoo, then followed it up a decade later with Black Messiah, an album in clear conversation with Isaac Hayes' Black Moses. Janelle Monáe is another disciple of progressive soul with her conceptual Afrofuturist Metropolis saga. Donald Glover's Awaken My Love is a modern classic of the genre, featuring clear influence from many of the artists we've talked about throughout this video. And I think both of Michael Kiwanuka's most recent albums fit within our understanding of the genre as well. Though most of its originators are gone, the legacy of progressive soul is alive and well today, as evidenced by the emergent scholarship and fan discussions on the genre. If this whole affair seems like an elaborate exercise in intellectualizing things so I could talk about some albums that I love, well, I mean, it kind of was. But I do think it's important to explore cases like this because they serve as a reminder that music history is not always a clear, set-in-stone thing. Genre is an ephemeral beast whose bounds are decided through the messy consensus of those who engage with it. That's a process that happens as a genre is being defined, but it's also a process that happens in retrospect as people keep coming back to music and finding new connections, new meanings in it. The ongoing reevaluation of progressive soul is particularly important because it represents a step toward the righting of historical wrongs. For far too long, a white, rock-centric musical world overlooked a brilliant genre thriving right alongside the music they loved to celebrate. Even when writing this video, I stumbled on a few discussions asking if progressive soul should be considered its own genre. And obviously genre is a subjective thing, but I think in this video, I've made a clear argument that it's got all of the trappings of genre. More than just shared sound and ethos, progressive soul shared clear aesthetic influences in its fashion and album covers. Prog soul artists release songs and albums in direct dialogue with each other, borrowing structures and naming conventions from each other. There's even musical licks, rhythms, and tropes that you see passed around throughout the people making progressive soul. My favorite of these is probably what I'm dubbing now the Prog Soul Scream, which you can hear in a bunch of places. So I'm hoping that maybe if you, like me for the first 25 odd years of my life, overlooked progressive soul, this video will serve as an introduction to a vibrant world that will change your experience of music forever. And if you're an old hat who's loved and recognized this genre since before I was born, Well, I hope I didn't do it a disservice, and I'd love to hear if you think there's anything missing from my vision of the Progressive Soul canon. Let's continue this conversation together. Let's build out this canon together, because this music rules, and it absolutely deserves to be celebrated. As a content creator and a semi-public figure, I've always been concerned about my own data privacy. Sure, my videos are online, but that doesn't mean that I want personal details about myself readily available for anyone who wants them. Keeping this kind of data privacy has become more and more difficult in recent years with the rise of data brokers who sell your online details to anyone. This can lead to identity theft, phishing scams, and even doxing. I don't know about you, but these are all things that I actively try to avoid. That's why I've started using Delete Me. Delete Me is a hands-free subscription service that'll remove your personal information that's being sold to these data brokers online. And it's super streamlined too. Just sign up, complete your profile, and let Delete Me do the rest. You'll receive a privacy report in 7 days as Delete Me gets to work removing all the personal data they find, and they'll continue to monitor for repeat removal as needed. If this sounds like something you're interested in, you can get 20% off Delete Me consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/polyphonic and use promo code polyphonic at checkout. I've also dropped the link in the description below if you want to check it out. Again, data privacy is actually like a really big issue, and these data brokers are super sketchy companies. So this is an awesome service that is helping fight back against our growing cyberpunk dystopia. So yeah, check it out. And hey, thanks for watching.